Mystical and Magical. A Bailey Bay Cozy Mystery. Bailey Bay Cozy Mysteries, Book 3. Written by Catherine Waltan. Narrated by Adrian Fleming. Chapter 1. Rosalind. When the earth shall revolt, and power seems untrue, then with the fire of light Hecate air holds true. Turning and tossing, I delved deeper into the surreal world of sleep, heartbeat escalating in tandem with my nightmare. I was in the woods, pulling out thorns from a copse of beautiful cherry blossoms. Sitting down on a boulder, I was humming a song of tranquility, feeling at one with nature. Rainbow eucalyptus trees, dragonblood trees, boab trees, and willow trees decorated the topology of the forest with branches and leaves swaying to the whim of the breeze. Not too far away, water cascaded down from a great height, forming a beautiful waterfall that I planned on checking out later. Then, suddenly, the scene changed. The trees began to shake violently like groups of rabid dogs that had suddenly lost all sense of instinct and survival. Then the flowers began to wilt and droop, turning ashen as the pollen and nectar dried up. The sky ahead suddenly darkened, sunlight hidden behind the thick curtains of the clouds. The breeze carried with it a tang of stinging heat. Rising to my feet, I was shocked by this transformation. The woods were my territory, my own personal world. I used to go nature-seeking with my father before he passed away. What is happening now? Why are the plants dying? Why can I feel the thrum of life drying up around me? I coiled into myself, closing my eyes off to the devastation happening around me, and urged a spiral of magic to pool together into the palms of my hands. I reached down and picked a wilted eucalyptus flower in my hands, feeding it the nurturing strength resonating in my palms. It strummed and buzzed, beginning to gather its vibrance. I was laughing with joy and happiness when it abruptly went up in flames. What? Reaching violently into my inner core, I applied every strength of magic I possessed, sending it into the delicate little flower nestled in my hands. But alas, it felt like I was trying to fetch water from a dried-up well. There was no feeling of magic anywhere within me, no vibration, no tickling of sensation that precede every conjuring I did. It was like I never had any magic to begin with. The foliage in the forest appeared dreary as well, the mystical trees drying up like a drop of adhesive exposed to air. Slowly, almost dismissively, a burning sensation throbbed in my lower ribs, gaining momentum as I walked around the forest, touching one tree after another in my bid to resuscitate whatever life was left in this dreary place. The pain wouldn't go away, though. It got worse and worse until I let out a harrowing scream. It burned all over. Heat coursed through my body, driving me into a state of paralyzed terror where I couldn't seem to find a way out. Like drops of lava upon an open wound, it reverberated through my entire body, and I thought briefly that I was going to lose my mind if the pain didn't let up anytime soon. Trying to locate a part of my mind that was still sane, I struggled with every fiber of my being to bring life blooms of tulips drenched with moisture to relieve the uncomfortable burning sensation. But it seemed everywhere the dewy tulips touched burned hotter, like projectiles of firepower. It hurt. Will I die from this? Besides, where am I? It seemed like the background was without form, changing in between dimensions to prevent me from getting my bearings. It was torture to someone with nature magic, watching the earth lose its roots in a distorted display of swirling realities. I fought to find a way out of this gridlock, fought with every power I possessed to halt this foreign invasion, this alien voice that was whispering arcane words that didn't hold any meaning to me. Fire of light, Hecate air holds true. The voice came again, with a surge of melting heat. Suddenly, the smell of sweat dripped past my nostrils. Then I remembered. I was on my bed in Dreynenn. I wasn't on fire. I was asleep. And just like that, I jerked awake. It felt like coming up for air after being submerged underwater for a long time. I sucked in the cool Dreynenn air that always alternated between the rains and heat in an amazingly balanced way. I was on my bed, surrounded by tulips and grasses swirling gently in the evening breeze, reaching up from underneath the bed to rustle against my cheeks and legs, carrying the smell of jasmine blooms from the windowsill that overlooked the balcony. At the foot of the satiny bed laid Shadow. I was puzzled by the look of anxiety reflecting in his tawny eyes. I expected him to be on his wool carrier, indulging in the pieces of salmon that I placed there for him before going to bed. But there he was, far off, and not even bothering to come any closer. Shadow was a proud Burmese cat, and he could be aloof when the mood struck him, but at least he wouldn't spare me his supposedly sage lectures. As his name formed on the tip of my tongue, something drew my attention downwards. In consternation, I realized that a part of the furniture was singed, and my hands were glowing with an otherworldly light that wasn't emitted by my power. Trying to infuse some of my nature magic into the glowing hands to heal the burn I felt, it came as nothing but a shock to feel the glow get brighter and brighter until it became blinding. Now, trepidation came alive in the recesses of my imagination, taking my mind back to the weird dream I just had. Is there a connection? Anima, erudiesel, frovgafruwe, I chanted, trying to manage my panic. I had faced worse than an uncomfortably realistic dream. From battling a conniving circle of acolytic individuals, to surviving the attack of ashlings, to disarming my crazy aunt when she tried to kill me months before. I convinced myself there was nothing to fear. Shadow sat on his paws, hypnotized by what was happening. The room grew unrealistically bright. I couldn't look down anymore. Shutting my eyes, thoughts and possibilities raced through my mind in a labyrinth of confusion. The glow seemed to extend out of me, almost like it was part of my anatomy outstretching to accommodate new and foreign elements. Without precedence, the glow died down. The room went back to its dim stare. But before I could take a breath of relief, another pain that yanked my breath away descended into a new region. Instinctively, I yanked my hand out of the heavy bed cover it was under and brought it out to view. Like a work of art, an inscription began to appear on the inside of my palm, between my thumb and middle finger. Transfixed like a child learning the fundamentals of magic, I watched a perfect epigraph take shape. It was the emblem of a wheel, with a bunch of Baranaya keys mingled with inflamed daggers. It was beautifully sculpted and sat regally on my palm. The inscription was familiar to me. I must have seen it somewhere amidst my mother's collection of books, since it was surely a fire signet, but I couldn't recall where exactly I saw it and what it meant. Considering the incidents of the past months, my mother's arrest and wrongful indictment that eventually culminated in the death of my aunt, I wasn't yet in my element. I didn't know what the mark meant and how it came to be emblazoned on my palm, but I succeeded in pushing the worry to the back of my mind at Shadow's prompting. Chapter 2. Rosalind. Dreynenn was a town of fairy tales, a town with explosive skylines, fascinating pieces of historical phenomenon, and air that refreshed, devoid of the pollution and rot prevalent in the human realm. The land was normally spluttered with festivities and magical displays, along with a mesmerizing cycle of birth and rebirth. Draenon thrived on the contributions of the elements given generously by the druids, fairies, witches, and madgelings. Everyone had a role to play in Dreynenn, Eberhold, Sanctum, and Vastoam, the last three being major cities that I had always wanted to explore. I heard that in Eberhold, sprites and fairies were seen almost everywhere, beings that I was yet to really understand. Occasionally, I saw them passing through Dreynenn, but they never settled down there because they complained about the powers of the ley lines. The power keeping the whole of the demesne was quite strong on this side of the lands, and being too close to the source made them susceptible to falling sick under its essence. It was funny that this very source they complained of was the source that powered the entirety of the lands, kept magic flowing through our veins. Vastoam was another place of mystery. There, herbs like Ethala plants, Vicro leaves, and Burbheim peels, amidst a barrage of other very special herbs, grew, making it the most powerful home for healers of every kind. I remembered taking my mother there for help after she lost her powers and took ill. Eberhold, on the other hand, was reputed for its special seasons and nights. For half of the year, it was daylight all through, while the entire half, it would go back to its normal routine of day and night. During the first 6 months, there were no cases or reports of ashlings, a spiteful group of witches with absolute bloodlust for drawing out the life force from madgelings and druids alike. Roaming about, from every supernatural creature they encountered, they sucked the life force out of. The ashlings were a pretty big deal, and to prevent falling prey to their deathly stares and tonsils, there was a curfew that everyone obeyed for survival. I thought it was beyond wonderful that for a period of time they would be gone. As a result, the 6 months were celebrated and referred to as a season of golden tranquility. I put aside thoughts of fantasies and trotting all over the demesne for more serious affairs. For the second time in 2 decades, the horn of the calling was about to go off. It was a week after the weird dream, and the Laurent family was having an outdoor picnic, a tradition that the humans picked up from them through the transitions of members from one realm to the other. Sitting by the lake, surrounded by your family members as you munched on finger foods and delicacy dishes made especially for this occasion, you'd assume that the picnic was going swimmingly. I guess, for one member of the family, the picnic was indeed heavenly. Shadow was busy devouring the bowl of milk garnished with syrup and tangerine, just the way he liked it. He was staying away from Arnica Laurent and her contemptible look. Smart feline. Admittedly, the picnic was going sideways. The colorful swatches of lace on dishes and bowls, in addition to the scenic backdrop consisting of healthy green grasses and random displays of flower heads, only served to accentuate the contradiction of the tense emotions hanging in the air among the family members. Alicia Laurent, known as the Fiery Princess, was trying to pass around a plate of cranberry sauce to her parents, but they rebuffed her. "What? You think we'd accept anything you made with those hands when those same hands killed your sister?" Arnica had spoken spitefully. She was a woman in her late 60s, with a complete hair of gray sprinkled with the occasional white, and she had her dander up. For months now, she had been harboring ill feelings towards my mother. Arnica blamed Alicia for being a portent of a bad omen. She thought Alicia's rotten luck infected the rest of the family. in a way, I felt guilty for everything. If it weren't for me, my mother would still have her flame magic, but she lost it trying to save me from a group of ashlings, a circle of life-sucking witch apparitions that roamed the region after dark. From there on out, it had been a series of ups and downs for my mother, from being terminally ill to being exiled from her hometown to getting framed for a murder she didn't commit. It had been a trying time for us all. Only my grandparents chose to shut their daughter out of the fold, and in the process, I was ostracized as well. Father, what about you? Alicia, with the same control that made her a formidable flame magling, had turned to her father with a stoic look on her face. Do you care for some? Hero, with his shocking white brows and cold eyes, looked at his daughter with barely concealed contempt. Maybe if you had cared for your sister in like manner, she would still be here with us. His look was quite frightening. I glanced at my mother and saw that she was struggling to hold on to her composure. Do they think Aunt Jessie's death didn't hurt her as well? Aunt Jessie had an alter ego that was psychopathic, and that was the only way she had been able to commit the murder of Amelia May Lee. She pulled the wool over everyone's eyes. Regardless, she had been part of the family, and families placed each other first. Still, I couldn't stop myself from picturing those lifeless blue eyes that were yanked out of their sockets, the blood pooling around the once radiant Amelia, an exuberant girl who was the same age as me. I couldn't reconcile the image of my playful, indulgent aunt with the mad, murderous witch on a treasure hunt. The loss was devastating, to say the least. Picking up my fork to spear a piece of mutton into my mouth, I thought over the incidents of the past months. Hey, Rose, do you mind snapping out of pity mood and getting me another bowl of milk, if you please? My cat telepathed the words to me in his usual haughty feline voice. Before I could oblige him, though, an ominous sound suddenly came alive, filling up the atmosphere with dread, reaching as far as the land of the barbarians, a land full of ostracized rebels and militants. It was the sound of the horn of the calling, the sound that preceded the beginning of the First Civil War and the War of the Damned, the sound that preceded the ascent of Hecate after her work was completed here in Dreynenn centuries ago. Hecate, the goddess of magic, had to ascend centuries ago to intervene on behalf of her worshippers. A group of rebellious and powerful corps d'elite had connived together to orchestrate a coup d'etat that was bloody. They massacred and maimed and rampaged the Demesne, cutting down anyone in their way to power. They were hungry and ravenous for power and wouldn't stop until Ithiel from the House of the Ravens, along with Sedek from the House of the Nyrogs, teamed up to combat their forces. In the end, Sedek lost his life, and Ithiel lost his daughter to the war. But that didn't stop him from doing the needful. He fought tooth and nail, even going as far as the mysterious land of the mists to retrieve the scepter of subservience. With this weapon, he single-handedly won the battle, succeeding in driving off the survivors to the Cimmerian end of the region, a land close to the forbidden plains of the Ashkelons, where nobody in their right mind ventured. That was the First Civil War. Afterward, the May Lee were the relic keepers of the Society of Magic. All the powers of Hecate's sacred animals poured into objects that were given to huge families. But there were disagreements between the families, and it led to a power tussle that shook all of Draenon. Hecate had to come again to settle the fight, and then shared each relic with a family. The War of the Damned took place centuries later, when monsters invaded the territory from the plains of Ashkelons. The Draconians, they were called, were a race from the hordes of hell. They were a part of the teachings of the bestiary included in Life Forces class taught to the children in Dreynenn. Wherever they went, they brought darkness and plague, half serpent, half human, with the powers to end all life. When they descended, the horn of calling went off, warning people of the danger. And this was how a lot of people were able to save themselves by arming their families ahead of time. This time, through the organized system put in place by the Dreynenn Parliament, the wards had been extended a bit to seal off the thin veil through which these beasts entered the Demesne. From that point, plains of Ashkelon became synonymous with dearth and infertility. To this day, nothing grew there. It was covered with ash and soot. I remembered the time I had ventured into the region in search for explanations and answers as to why my mother was falsely accused of a crime she didn't commit. It was a time of dread and terror for me. I recalled that I went with Aunt Dweeb. I borrowed the words of Matthias, Cole's younger brother. Matthias had been kidnapped and tortured by his own uncle, who intended to give him up as a sacrificial offering in his quest to awaken an ancient god of destruction from the underworld. It was funny that people could be so deceitful. Aunt Jessie had been the epitome of care and affection as she took me through the plains of Ashkelon, watching out for me and regaling me with tales of Dreynenn history in her deceptively sweet, angelic voice. If only I knew that the murderer I searched for was beside me, smiling and lecturing me on inane history, leaving out significant parts in her bid to mislead me. Shaking my head of such thoughts, my mind took me to the ominous sound that always preceded evil of any kind. The horn of calling was sacred, and when it was blown, mesmerized dread followed. For me, the sound came with the paralyzing power of déjà vu. An acidic feeling of fear took over, keeping me stuck. I was besieged by thoughts of cold, emotionless officers of the Alabaster Corps dragging my mother away. Remembered the dreary Craftoline Manor invaded by ghosts. I thought quickly of grabbing my mother and fleeing. Anything was better than being imprisoned again. Jittery with fright, I didn't know what to do. When the cool, collected voice of my cat came again, I sighed in appreciation. "Simmer down, Rosalind. No use worrying over nothing. You don't have another aunt anywhere else, do you?" the cat joked to mollify the worry visible. At that playful reminder, a bit of fear dipped out of me, and I got back enough of my senses to move along with my kin. The bickering amongst my family members was halted in response to the heaviness that hung in the air. What is it now? Has someone else been killed? Grabbing my mother's clammy hands, we made our way to Ash Square to see what the fuss was about. My glass armor was thrumming underneath the surface in anticipation. No one was taking my mother anywhere. I would fight to the last of my breath. Chapter 3. Wilhelm. Heavy lies the head that wears the crown. I thought that was not aptly put. Heavy lies the head that bears the crown was more accurate. Thrust into the role of a numero uno from an early age of 13 years, I was weary, burnt out, and in a rut that drained my vitality every time I was presented with a case where a member of Draenon was to be executed. Draenon was my home. I was born here and lived here all my life. Unlike other mages, I was not permitted to be away from Dreynenn for any duration of time. To outsiders, I must seem to be this stern, taciturn, ancient wizard who tossed out rules and obligations binding on all citizens in my pursuit of pleasure and glory, basking in the groans and agony of the people I presided over. But that wasn't the truth. The truth was that I hurt just like they did. I relapsed just like they did. I was prone to fall into temptations just like they were. For every person I sentenced to death, for every person I imprisoned in craftoline manner, I felt their pain double-fold, locked in invisible chains of misery that was not to be seen by outsiders, but left to fester in the deep recesses of my mind, forever plaguing me with the feverish heat of guilt and bloodshed. I loved my home. I loved this world, so harmonious in its traditions, but spectacular in its diffusions. I was a descendant of the great Ithiel from the House of Ravens, and a protege of Hecate, the goddess herself. After Hecate breathed the life force that created magic, she gave Ithiel the dome of fire to keep and nourish, promising to sustain the essence of the fire in the world they built together. Hecate kept her promise. For centuries, magic bloomed all around them. It was seen and admired in the works of nature, revered in the combined cacophony of the 5 elements of magic that existed: nature magic, flame magic, wind magic, water recovery magic, and earth magic. 5 great houses were born, tasked with unique obligations, and each integral to the intrinsic balance that wove the foundation of magic itself. And now this happened. The ley lines were unraveling. Magic was dying. The Aztag tree that carried the life force to the ley lines was drying up. Its leaves were withering away, and its branches were turning brittle. The circle of magical stones encompassing the tree made it look like a ceremonial obsequy. What could have caused the ley lines to begin to untangle? I looked up and realized that a large crowd was beginning to form, with many peering over the bulwark that separated the sacred tree and the circle of stones from curious onlookers. All the crowd saw was the jarring presence of all the helmsmen in charge of the affairs of the Demesne gathered in one place: the Council of Elders, the Alabaster troops, the Parliament, and finally, the leader of the entire force, Wilhelm the Regal. I turned back to observe the Earth Mage, Orion of the House of Mewd. His long silvery hair was visible and recognizable by any who saw it. His eyes also had flecks of silver in them, making him different from the rest of his kind. Orion was bent over with his right hand touching the earth. His eyes were closed in concentration, his brows pulling together every now and then. The ley lines glowed beneath the earth in response to his provocation. It was a fiery red intermingled with threads of yellow, but thin black veins were beginning to weave around the entire entanglement, shrouding the fiery red and yellow energy beneath its abyss. The 5 men that made up the Council of the Elders were observing the exchange with looks of solemnity and anxiety in their eyes. One of the elders stepped forward with a bottle of swirling green that he poured over the sick ley lines. The elder, Elvis, was a water recovery mageling, together with another elder from the House of Raven, same as me. They concocted the vial. Elder Novik, a close cousin of mine, was a maestro in the art of poison and elixirs. The 2 of us combined forces to see if we could heal the ley lines. Before I was informed, we already worked to create the draft. The vial was a result of days of perusing ancient knowledge found in the ageless books of spells and shadows that the elders had in our repertoire. As the vial went down and was soaked into the earth,
The ley lines went completely dark for some seconds, before the darkness faded away to be replaced by a lackluster Alzarian red with silver undertones and a new color, gray. This was not a sign of improvement. This was a sign that things were getting really bad. The elders stepped back, joining the other three. Orion rose to his feet with a look of resignation on his face. Legs spread apart, he dusted sand off his hands and then looked at me, the leader. The ley lines have been tampered with. One of the lines has been untangled, and another one will come undone by the end of today. Heavy words. Heavier implications. Everyone took in large gulps of air in reaction. Down the slope, the crowd was getting a bit wild. It looked like they were picking up on the insecurity and fear evident in the air. They seemed to be close to overwhelming the Alabaster Corps officials. A small nod to a member of the Parliament from Wilhelm sent the man scurrying down to address the restless crowd before they broke out in utter confusion. "From what you've said, what do you think is causing this catastrophe?" Novak inquired. Orion paused for a moment before continuing. "All I can say is that the lines have been tampered with. From the heat signatures I perceived, intruders have been siphoning its powers for a couple of months now." Stupefied, the elders and parliamentals looked at one another with similar thoughts in their minds. "But that's not possible, is it?" Another elder, Artfail, commented. "The Ashlings keep the circle protected during the night, and coming close to perpetrating such offense in daylight is not even feasible." Artfail was from the House of Melee, keepers of relics and ancient powers. "To get anywhere close to siphoning powers, the perpetrators would need ancient relics and vestiges carrying puissant clout." Artfail glanced around, at the Aztag tree, at the somber faces of the leaders of Dreynenn. "The Melee have kept the ancient relics and scepters safe for centuries. We have no knowledge of any one of the objects put in our care going missing." Elder Roland of the House of Laurent spoke up. "What of the phoenix crown belonging to House Laurent? Is it safe?" There was a look of hesitation in Artfail's eyes before he responded. "The crown? Oh, of course it's safe. After what happened with Amelia and your kin turning out to be the murderer, we buffed up our security and changed the location of the artifact." Elder Roland shook his head. "I told you. That part of the Laurent clan is a distant relation, as is Nathaniel Harper. We only share genealogy the way every one of us here does." "Oh no, not like everyone else here," Elder Artfail murmured. I decided to step in before the exchange turned violent. It wasn't a secret that the Melee and the Laurents had it out for each other. Amelia's death had shaken the family because she was betrothed to be married to my immediate younger brother, Tobias. Everyone knew that being married into the House of the Ravens was a thing of delight. Amelia had a bright future ahead of her, a future that was snatched away from a deranged, power-hungry woman from the House of Laurent, Jessica Laurent. Even the thought of her name evoked feelings of guilt and failure. I should have known that something was wrong with that phony, deceptively mild front she always presented. I should have known beneath the smiling face lurked the heart of a predator. But she pulled the wool over everyone's eyes, and that was more painful to me than anything else. I was in charge of protecting these people. It was my sacred responsibility. The deed has been done. Amelia's death is a loss we'll all have to deal with one way or the other. Her death was unfortunate and unnecessary, but what's happened has happened. We have to accept it. Pointing fingers right now isn't doing anyone much good, isn't doing the community any good, I admonished. In the history of magic, this has never happened before, the ley lines being tampered with. We all know what will happen if we don't find a solution quickly.
Chapter 4. Rosalind. "Give it back here!" I screeched in annoyance, stomping my feet in vexation. How was it possible for a familiar to be so exasperating? Shadow had my favorite milk silk top clutched between his fangs. He didn't look like my theatrics was bothering him, and was instead waiting for me to listen to what he had to say. I really wasn't in the mood to be accommodating. All I knew was that Cole, a boy I met from my time in the human world, commented on how much the tank top flattered my alabaster complexion. Boy, oh boy, with that sweet heavenly voice of his, I am smitten. In his absence, I compensated myself with the memory of his smile, the joy that lit up his eyes whenever I came close. "Hey, Rose, maybe we need to keep our thoughts centered right now," Shadow reprimanded in that undertone he knew I loathed, but he delighted in. "Give it back here, Shadow, and we'll talk." He sneered. Can you imagine such lofty attitude coming from my impish sidekick? "Say whatever you want. I am having my way." He lifted his front paw in smugness. "Oh, for God's sake!" Throwing up my hands in agitation, I turned away from him. Crazy, elvish little cat. "I heard that," he projected back into my mind with a sneer. I waved him off and wandered upstairs to my room to get a change of clothes for my trip down to Varick Plains. I planned on watching the bashful teens and mage fledglings work on their elements with their strict, no-nonsense instructors. I could still recall how thoroughly I had been schooled in the doctrines of voodooism, symbolism, nature magic, spells, and whatnots. It was no fun to a student, but for someone who was done with the drills and exercises, it was invigorating watching beginners fumble their way through. And right now, I needed all the fun I could get. At the back of my mind, nibbling thoughts of Shadow's warning went off in my brain. Shadow was skilled in identifying auras and elements. I could recall all those times I was saved from dicey situations by his intuition. So why wasn't I listening to him now? I frowned. Maybe I couldn't afford the luxury of listening to his sage advice at the moment. I was on edge. The weird dream occurred 3 more times since the first week it happened, each occurrence more powerful than the last. Shadow compounded my worries by telling me that something about me was changing. An awakening, he called it. I didn't know what he meant by that. Was it my glass magic malfunctioning, or was I misdirecting the flow of my nature magic? I knew that possessing 2 powerful elements was rare. Having the 2 elements meant you would be treated differently, sometimes with awe and sometimes with dread. But to lose control over both elements was unheard of. Or was it? My father always talked about how special I was. He told me over and over again how I was yet to discover the true extent of my capabilities. I always chalked up his conversation to a father's pride. I really wished I didn't have to go through this challenge at the moment. Stopping in front of my mother's door, I briefly considered venturing inside, but then changed my mind. My mother was well versed in the art of self-control, and though this discipline helped her to scale through hurdles, it was nonetheless an obstacle in building relationships with her kinsmen, especially her daughter. Recently, my mother was aloof, withdrawn. If it weren't for the lack of ashen color, I would think she was sick again. Now, my mother stayed indoors from day to night. She had her meals brought up to the room by eager servants and workers in the house. She didn't want to speak to anyone, didn't want to talk to anyone. You could scarcely blame her. She lost her power a while ago. Her husband was killed a little before that. She was imprisoned in the spine-chilling Craftaline manor for several weeks for a crime she didn't commit, and then lost her sister in a fight that would have ended her daughter's life. It was no balm that her parents looked at her with resentment and rancor. I only wished she would turn to her daughter for comfort. Knowing my mother, that was an impossibility. Turning away from the door, I walked resolutely down to my own room to change clothes. In the midst of all this, the mystery of the horn of the calling going off wasn't lost on me. I remembered the anxiety pooling off everyone present in the gathering hours before. I, like everyone else, didn't know the reason for the abrupt call, but I suspected that whatever it was, the powers that be weren't disclosing. The Alabaster Corps, with their apathetic, expressionless faces, and the Council of the Elders with their dark, somber attires. And then, the leader of the Dreynenn Parliament, Wilhelm the Regal. His presence weighed heavily on my heart, much more than anything did. It sapped me of my waning strength so that I felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. Seeing the man again filled me up with bane and malignity so much that I wanted to drive a spear right through his eyes. He was the man who ordered my father's death. Seeing him in his regal apparel, looking like his usual fine self while my father's ashes were scattered all over the universe, his essence sucked up by the cycle of life and rebirth in Draenon to boost the power of its residents, made me ache for revenge, not justice. Justice was too mild for a man who gave the order to end my father's life. Feeling the bile toil within me, I felt heat color my face, but somehow I managed to restrain myself by dwelling on the beautiful memories I had of my dear father. Less than an hour later, I was making my way downstairs, with Shadow coiled snugly around my neck. Miffed as I was, I didn't want to leave the house without my cat's companionship. I conjured up a minuscule thread of vine to sit prettily around my wrist, dropping slightly to hide the aberrant sigil on my hand. I popped by the kitchen, grabbed an apple, and was making my way out when I saw a procession of somber-looking men in official alabaster uniforms and parliamentary regimentals. Confused about their presence, I hung back a bit, standing in the shadow of the pillar that supported the wall beams on the east end. What were they doing here? Then I shifted my gaze a bit and saw the leader, Wilhelm. Heart in throat, I reared up, my eyes dilating in fear. Whatever reason it was for their presence, I knew I wouldn't like it. Tapping Shadow lightly, I uncoiled him from around my neck and gave him a wordless prompt that he immediately understood. Watching him crouch and slither stealthily along the walls, I couldn't help but be thankful for his friendship. What would I have done without Shadow? He was my constant source of joy. I was beholden to him and his earthreal presence in my life. My gaze returned to the men. The door was opened by one of the servants to admit the men into the house. There was a tightening in my lower abdomen that I couldn't decipher, but understood as intense resentment. A minute passed, then another minute, and still, all remained quiet inside. I was tempted to go back inside to find out for myself what was going on, but knew if I stepped back in, I would lose an advantage by getting caught. So I decided to trust my cat and stay still. 15 minutes later, Shadow returned, his agility showing clearly in the way he raced across the expansive area. Obviously, he took delight in this covert mission. Bending for him to jump into my arms, he rolled around until he was comfortably settled in before giving me his attention. Try as he might, he couldn't tuck or dismiss the anxiety I could read clearly in there. "Well?" I nudged. Lifting his head, his golden eyes shone into mine.
They want your father's grimoires.
What? I mumbled. They want what? My father's grimoires.
That's what I said.
But they can't. Those belong to my dad, I cried. Wait, what did my mum say?
She told them to their faces that she would never relinquish her husband's research works to people who murdered him. Not appeased by mere words that could be overridden by a strict command from one of these diabolical men, I paced in anxiety.
Should I just go back inside and bust in? Maybe even call up some dangerous shafts of vine?
And then what? A voice asked.
Then, I would...
I drew up a blank at that question.
I didn't know what I would do.
Could do. If I tried to go up against them, one thing was certain. I would fail. And then I would be labeled a Dreynenn traitor. If I wasn't hung or denounced, I would be banished to the nether regions of the land of the barbarians, where morals and scruples were non-existent.
I couldn't lose my mother. Couldn't lose my familiar.
The only thing I could do was be on my merry way. For the good of everyone, I summoned courage and trudged on.
Chapter 5. Rosalind. By the time I reached Varick Plains, I was already seething and foaming at the mouth. How could the Dreynenn Parliament take it upon themselves to personally see to the misery of my family? Hadn't they done enough? Now, they were in my house trying to strong-arm my mother into handing over her husband's research works. For what purpose? Was there something they needed in the pages of my father's grimoires? What could it be? My father had been a peacemaker, practicing his nature magic to see all the possibilities. As I thought about what could possibly be important in the pages of his work, the irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. Walking around the bend, the scene changed to flatbed plains, meadows arrayed with meadow beauties like cymosmos flowers, the flashy rainbow colors of the icodrum flowers amidst the dandelion weeds and cherry blossoms. It was all very alluring. I could feel my nature magic coiling within me, wanting to reach out to nourish the wan rose petals crushed underneath the dandelion weeds. But I couldn't do much good for the plants. To pull magic from my inner core, I needed to feel clear emotions, either gentility or a need to defend. At this moment, I felt offensive. My father taught me how to maneuver my magic to become offensive, but I rarely ever used it as such, so I wasn't sure how to bring it on whenever the mood struck. I had to calm down to do that, which was almost like a contradiction. When you felt the need to offend, there was no calm or serenity in you at that moment. Instead of my gentle, nurturing nature magic, I felt another darker, alien power breathe within me. It didn't feel like my glass magic either, but I knew I was leaving what the witches called the pit of control, and was slipping into a chasm of rage. My father didn't hurt anybody. All his life he did nothing but help, and they killed him for it. Almost killed my mum, and now they wanted his grimoires. Rose, you need to calm down, right now. My cat's reprimand seemed to emanate from far away, even though he was snuggled cozily around my neck. I didn't seem to observe that I was walking through teenagers and instructors now. A fine display of water patterns aided by wind synergy rose in the air, breathing as the shape was controlled by the bubbling energy of its conjurers. On the other side, the leaves of the old willow tree, similar to the one in St. Crest, swayed and writhed underneath the strong breeze stirred up by madgelings as they struggled to attain perfection with their elements. I didn't feel the excitement I usually did whenever I was here.
Seeing the smiles and guffaws from everyone here only served to reiterate the absence of one nature magic instructor. My father had been a brilliant teacher. The wards and protégés under his training were usually the best during the summer-long element contest that was organized to bring everyone together in a carnival of activities and color outbursts. Recalling his gentle voice as he was being led to the gallows during the Red Sun, a period where executions were carried out, the anger rose like a living thing within me, controlling my movements, my thoughts. "Rose, it hurts!" Shadow screeched, writhing around my neck, but I didn't notice. I felt the heat come alive within the recesses of my mind. It rose like a crescendo, gathering momentum like a tornado inside of me. Suddenly, it burst out in tongues of fire, lapping up the grasses and flowers alike. As it devoured the flowers and weeds, it changed color, almost like it was sucking the vibrancy out of the flowers it ravaged. To me, it was, in one word, beautiful. To others, it was disastrous. I felt the ball of fur leap off my neck in shrieks, but I didn't seem to mind. Turning my gaze to the right, I saw a group of fire mages jump out of my way with loud screeches and wails. Why were they screaming? In front of me, teenagers and instructors scampered about, each calling forth their magic with mad desperation. Did they think they could stop me? Again, the heat burst out like a dam, rushing towards the group of cowering earth users. A part of me laughed in reaction. Let me see them evade this. I called up a flower bed from beneath my palm and thrust it towards them with a fiery ball of fire that rushed to do my bidding. Immediately, the group scattered as they ran for their lives. Smoke rose into the air in a polychrome of riotous colors. It was awesome. By the side, Shadow was dancing around in a mad frenzy, chasing his tail. When I saw smoke rising from his tail, I smiled. Serves the cat right for pulling the stunt of ruining my favorite top earlier. I felt powerful, invincible. Glancing to my left, I released the mayhem of fire again, unleashing it in tandems and kaleidoscopes of chromatic merging. Everywhere I looked caught on fire, like nature was blending with flame into one measure. I felt like an artist, decorating a blank canvas and watching my masterpiece come to life. Leveling my gaze on a group of hapless teenagers, the heat grew even hotter as I began to release its torrents again. But before I could, a loud rhythm of chanting came like a wisp from behind me, words rushing and tripping over each other in a language that I didn't seem to comprehend. The words disturbed my outburst, and as I turned with glowing golden eyes to direct my heat towards this intruder, my eyes rolled to the back of my head, and I went down in a dead faint. Chapter 6. Cole. It felt surreal being back here. I couldn't explain how ecstatic it was to be here in Eberhold, Dreynenn. It was 3 months since the last time I saw Rosalind, the object of my enamor. I had tried to get back here several times by using the instructions given to me by my younger brother, Matt, who was now back in school, writing his exams. Matt was a madgeling, one whose story was told less than a year ago. He would have died cruelly at the hands of my maniac uncle. Rose came to my rescue by ferreting out the great evil that would have gone on hunting and killing innocent children for power and immortality. But more than my gratitude for her was my passion for this gentle soul. She had beautiful black hair that extended down to her waist in curls, with the most alluring almond-shaped green eyes I ever saw. She was breathtaking. I couldn't believe that I didn't immediately notice she was different back when she was in the human world and attending the same high school, Flores High. Admittedly, she was eccentric, with her equally eccentric black cat following her about. If only I had known what she was and how much she would come to mean to me, I wouldn't have wasted precious hours away from her. She let me know that there was more than one Demesna in this plane. There was the human world and the supernatural world. A world of witches, fairies, madgelings, and gods. A world where every myth and legend taught in the human world as stories and fairy tales were true. I had not been the same since I discovered all these impossibilities. I couldn't go back to being content with football and being the ladies' guy that I used to be. Knowing Rosalind changed me. When I opened my eyes the day before to view the morning sunlight on my face in my room, I was stunned to see one Alabaster Corps official staring down at me. He ordered me to get up and told me we were going on a little trip. Knowing how impossible it would be to try to fight him off, and not really wanting to because I knew he was bringing me here, I hurried to dress up, forgetting to even close up my buttons in haste. He took me to a place around Adley's cafeteria, a place I always thought was bizarre with its cold drafts of unsettling breeze any time I passed through. He uttered some spells that I couldn't understand, and then suddenly a portal opened up, and I saw an angel oak tree with its mythical leaves and branches that forever swirled in an arc, like a windmill with its coordinated movements. I never realized that there was a tree hidden in the landscape, serving as a portal to the arcane group of individuals, an entry into this mythological world that I was yet to truly, if not completely, understand. Rosalind fluttered her eyes once, twice before she became lucid. Her eyes locked on mine first in confusion, like she couldn't decide if she was dreaming or awake, and then cleared into light when I reached over to touch her cheek. "Cole, what are you doing here?" She made a move to rise, but I held her down gently by leaning over. "I was brought here by—" I glanced towards the entrance, and her gaze followed me. She observed her mother standing off to the side, her grandparents, as well as a girl she might have seen around town. The sound of movement somewhere down called her attention to Shadow, who was busy snarling at his own paws, lost in his feline world as he nudged around the bowl of milk that I made him earlier. He must not be very hungry because he kept pushing the bowl away only to pull it close, then sneer and push it away again. What cat doesn't like a bowl of plain old milk? Like I said, he was a weird cat. Then I shifted my gaze a little bit and saw an Alabaster Corps standing in front of the door, a staff of authority in his hand as he gazed off into the distance, withdrawn from the rest of us. I saw Rose's eyes narrow in disapproval as she turned to look at her mother with a question in her eyes. Her mother must have understood what her daughter was asking because she shook her head in response before coming close to take hold of her hand. "Put that worry away for now. Let us focus on what happened yesterday. You fainted," the grandfather spoke. "But not before you tried to mass murder a quarter of the Dreynenn population." His voice was devoid of any empathy. He was probably irked that this happened to his granddaughter. There was silence in the room for a moment. I felt tension in the air that I couldn't decipher. Alicia Laurent, Rose's mother, who had brightly colored blonde hair and green eyes so much like her daughter's, beamed her daughter a beauteous smile meant to assuage her worry. "Don't worry. No one was seriously hurt. They will be all right." "But what happened?" The hand that I had in mine shook, and I knew she was worried. Squeezing her hand back in assurance, I listened to the conversation. The green-haired lady stepped forward to answer. "Your flame magic went out of control." Every other person in the room, excluding me because I was completely in the dark, and the Corps official because he was here only on orders, exchanged looks of confusion.
But she doesn't possess that element.
The lady chuckled.
Oh, trust me, she does. And the peculiar thing is that her flame magic doesn't emit the usual heat signature like every other flame magic user. Hers is very unique and very, very powerful. I felt the force of it when I put her to sleep. Normally, no one in the history of magic stayed that long before succumbing to sleep whenever that particular spell was recited. Whenever it was uttered, the flame user would go unconscious before the end of the third line. If I had not been so vested in knowing the entire spell by rote, I would have run out of lines to bring her under.
Alicia Laurent was nodding.
You used the spell of ages?
That's correct, ma'am. There was a discernible note of respect in the lady's voice when she addressed Rose's mother. That meant Alicia was highly ranked. Alicia's brows pulled together in a frown of concentration that reminded me of her daughter.
I can't imagine how she is awake now. Did you get to the end of the spell?
No, but I got close.
The 8th line.
It seemed that statement was quite vital because even the alabaster soldier looked at the lady sharply before turning away.
That's...
Shaking her head, the grandmother looked down at Rose from afar, not bothering to come close like any grandmother would normally do to make sure their charge was all right. Rose seemed to be lost in all of this.
8th line? I don't understand. What does it all mean?
Before the girl could venture a response, Alicia blurted out one question.
Cole, what did the Corps soldier tell you when he brought you here?
Being put in the spotlight without warning rattled me for a moment before I cleared my throat and gave a reply. He told me that I was to speak sense into Rose and get her permission.
For what?
The grandmother asked curtly, her eyes carrying an emotion that was gone before I could try to unravel it. He didn't say. As they glanced at each other, they seemed to come to a realization that I wasn't aware of.
Chapter 7. Rosalind. Having Alicia Laurent go back to being the caring, doting mother I knew was quite rewarding. It was 2 days after the fire outburst, and I discovered that I slept the last night away. Pausing for a moment to stare at the mark on my palm, a rose petal opened up to bestow its nectar at my prompt. Since coming fully awake this morning, I had been sucking on the nectars of the petals I conjured up. Feeling at odds with a part of me, I brought to life several flowers: barberry, dandelion, lavender, whiteberry, and cherry blossoms amidst others. They formed a visage of dazzling doodles from the top of my head to the soles of my feet, where I basked in the silky, comfortable nosegay of these colossal bouquets and nurtured my nature magic so it could heal. The door opened, and my mother appeared, carrying a gigantic tray completely filled with jars, bottles, and bowls of variegated contents. Inside the bottles and jars were poultices of plantain herbs, oxymel for strength, reishi mushroom tincture, along with pulverized bark from the angel oak tree that grew somewhere outside the scarlet meadow. She set the tray before me and began to administer the decoctions one after the other. My taste buds were sweetened 1 minute, then embittered the next as I moved from one taste to another. "You need to recover," she remarked, when I complained about the taste at one point. "The nectar is not enough." I took the rest of the herbs and potions in silence, enjoying her at work. I missed my mum like this, determined and focused, not the sad, withdrawn recluse she had been over the past months. "You are staring," she observed. "Maybe that is because I like seeing you without creases of worry and unhappiness on your face." Alicia smiled. "Of course. I don't mean to walk around with a cloud hanging over my head. It's just..." She looked away for a moment. hard knowing how to move on. I placed my hand on hers. "We'll be fine, Mom. I promise you." We exchanged a look of understanding. Then she spoke, and the understanding dwindled away. "I'm going to give them the papers, Rosalind." Maybe I didn't hear her well. I'm going to hand over your father's grimoires to them. Obviously, they need it for something, and giving them surely won't hurt anyone. It's going to hurt me! I threw off the bed cover covering my torso in anger. I will never let you do that. I can't believe she is even thinking about giving in to their demands. These are the people who killed your father, baby, and almost killed me as well. There is little we can do to stop them. Just imagine, they brought your boyfriend here from the human world to get us to comply. He's leverage, Rosa. Temper rising, blood boiling, I yelled, "I don't care, and don't call me Rosa. Only my father called me Rosa, and you are not him." "Baby, it seems like you are not thinking straight." Her voice was calm and collected. "Don't call me baby either." As I ended the sentence, something leaped out of me, burnt the whole bouquet I was wrapped up in. But surprisingly enough, I remained unscathed. Then, like laser beams of rocket fire, it headed straight for the alabaster core, who immediately dodged and made a beeline for the door. The beams of fire jumped into the air and catapulted straight at the windowsill, where it disintegrated the jasmine petals in a crackling fume of heat. At this point, I wasn't angry anymore. I was incredulous. The fire left dust and debris in its wake, covering me with soot. My mother looked at me with incredulous round eyes. "Rose, we are going to your father's library right now. We need help." Throwing my legs over the side of the bed, I agreed wholeheartedly. It turned out to be an exercise in futility. Upon getting there, we read through the heavy, musty leather-bound books, exhausting time and energy to get through the voluminous pages of my father's life work, but couldn't find anything meaningful. We moved on to my mother's collection of books to decipher the cause of this aberration, thinking that we were going to run into something tangible, since my mother was a flame magic user, and my problem had its roots in flame magic. 9 hours later, we were dusty, with limbs aching, and nowhere closer to solving the mystery of the magic and the mark. Chapter 8. Coal. I was having my lunch of omelets, oyster sauce, applesauce, blueberry muffins, and chicken casserole while pursuing a book of spells that Alicia gave me to keep busy. It contained barrels and barrels of information that looked fascinating and quite refreshing. Who knew that rose petals could be crushed and used in a way that would change the color of your eyes for the length of a year? I was enjoying my leisure time, basking in the sun rays that streamed through the stained glass doors in the light room, a room made for refreshment of the mind, when the door was kicked in forcibly and a team of formidable lords filed into the room, along with a group of 7 Alabaster Corps members present. They took their positions in the room. 2 fell out of the formation and headed upstairs with a dogged look in their eyes. They returned some minutes later, dragging a pale Rosalind and her struggling mother. Immediately, I jumped up, upending the contents on the table as I rushed to go defend the 2 hapless women. But I didn't take more than 2 steps before I came up against a wall. Only there was nothing in front of me. Only air. Looking around, I saw one of the elders of the council with a crooked smile on his face as he watched me struggle futilely. I knew I couldn't fight it, but I didn't stop trying to break free. Where the hell were they taking the ladies to? I wouldn't stand and watch them use their superiority to their advantage.
I was half tempted to reach into the back of my denim jeans to pull out my cell phone and place a call to the police, but then remembered this was not home, and the only equivalence of cops was the Alabaster Troop. There was no form of recourse here, no protocol to come to our aid. "You can't do this to us," Alicia cried, but the soldiers refused to let them go. I saw one soldier venture back out the door, returning a moment later with the green-haired lady that was here yesterday. Her gypsy features, small nose, small lips, and small stature, somehow made her look formidable as she glanced around, going into a defensive stance at the perceived threat she felt. "At ease, Veda." It was an order that she immediately obeyed. Oh, so her name was Veda, the lady with the green hair and sharp reflexes. The head of the troop, the most formidable among them all, who was also a head taller than the rest and who had piercing bluish-red eyes, stepped forward with his hands behind his back. Immediately Veda relaxed her guard, and I watched a look of reverence take over her expression. "Hold on. Before you take us anywhere, at least let us know what we've done this time." Rosalind spoke with a slur in her voice, and I reacted to it. She was only running on nectar and herbs and wasn't in any shape to be dragged anywhere right now. She was still in her PJs, for crying out loud. The leader of the troop stepped forward and turned to the women. From where I was, I couldn't see his expression, but from his enraged tone, I knew he was deeply upset. "You, Rosalind, connived with your mother to corrupt the ancestral ley lines, and now that you've taken the power for yourself, it has become too much for your body to harness." He stated it as a matter of fact. "What?" Rosalind, Alicia, and even Veda exclaimed at once. In that moment, the two women stopped struggling to get away from the soldiers. From the mutual expressions of stupefaction, I knew what was just said bowled them over. I didn't understand the magnitude of the statement, but I understood the intensity of their reaction meant they were all in trouble. "If the ley lines have been corrupted, then what are we doing fighting one another? We should be looking for a solution, fast," Alicia said. Then it clicked. "Hold on. That was why you demanded my husband's grimoires?" Another elder sneered. "Don't act like you didn't plan all this, woman." "But I didn't. I don't understand why you'd accuse my daughter and I of this great evil, Wilhelm. I don't understand why you always point your accusing fingers at our family any time things go awry. If you and your minions can't do your jobs, then maybe it's time to change the order of things in Dreynenn." Alicia raged in a flash flood of bitterness and indignation. The Alabaster Corps holding her lifted his hand to deal Alicia a blow at her insolence, but Wilhelm shook his head to stop that action. "We never jump to conclusions, woman. We follow the evidence. We carry out our investigations. We consult the elders of the council. When all roads lead down one road, we trail it to the end and ensure justice is served well. Don't judge us for where the investigation leads." "And your investigation has led you, once again, to our doorstep." The mother spoke with rancor and loathing in her voice that she didn't even try to hide. There was something spooky about the man in charge. His ageless eyes were cold and fathomless, like he had seen so much that couldn't be said, endured much that couldn't be explained. "Yes," was his response, and he turned at that, his cape turning in a dramatic arc as well. "Wait!" It was Veda. The procession suddenly halted from proceeding to carry the women out forcibly. "Perhaps there is another explanation no one is considering here," she spoke, licking her dry lips. "Which is?" one elder demanded roughly. "Maybe Rosalind is not the problem, but the solution." Everywhere went silent. Then, "Explain," Wilhelm ordered. Veda took a deep breath.
The powers of the ley lines are too great to be harnessed into one body, and anybody that tries it is surely suicidal.
We haven't established the sanity of either Rosalind or her mother, so that's a moot point, another elder chipped in. To Cole, it was almost like they made up their mind. All they saw was a family who was out for blood, for the murder of one of their own. They weren't inclined to see past that. Veda started to move when, like automated machines, the 5 Alabaster Corps soldiers extended their weapons so fast that she went still on the spot. "Don't move," they chorused.
"Oh, okay. I just wanted—"
She was shaken, placing a hand on her bosom in fright.
"There's a mark on Rosalind's left hand, between her thumb and index finger. I saw it just as I came up behind her 2 days ago at Verrick Plains. I knew I had seen it somewhere before, and I puzzled over it since then. It wasn't until yesterday that I remembered where I had seen it before."
"Go on."
"As a young child, I've always been curious about getting to the bottom of puzzles. My mother belonged to the sect of individuals that were ordered to tuck away every book containing spells that had the power to upset the balance of the realms. In the pages of one particular book, there is a mark drawn there, and it's the same mark on Rosalind's hand. I remember the book fell open to that particular page as they were being packed away, and I saw it. It was a peculiar drawing, and it called out to me. That's why I can still remember it."
"And what's the mark?" Even as Wilhelm spoke, he gave the order for Rosalind to be brought forward and ordered her to stretch forth her hand. She resisted at first, but then thought better of it and cooperated.
"It's the mark of Hecate, the goddess of magic herself."
Silence. "That can't be right," an elder protested. Veda glanced at Wilhelm furtively.
"I know you possess blood magic to ferret out the truth from someone who is lying. So do what you have to do to find out for yourself if I'm speaking the truth or lying."
Wilhelm watched her for 2 heartbeats before looking away. "She speaks the truth. Go on. Tell us more." Veda sighed.
"All I know is the prophecy that was inscribed underneath the drawing. It read, 'When the earth shall revolt, and power seems untrue, then, with the fire of light, Hecate heir holds true. She is Hecate's heir.'"
I saw the moment it became too much for Rosalind to bear. She started to heave on the spot, her loud breathing echoing all around the room. She was gasping and writhing, and was immediately released by the Alabaster Corps holding her captive. Brightness suddenly came alive, glowing from her chest and spreading to her arms and then down the length of her body. The mark on her palm, the mark of Hecate, glowed even brighter, like the rays of the sun. Suddenly, she opened her mouth and began to speak in an ancient tongue. It wasn't her voice that came through, but it felt like she was being taken over. I saw her slowly weave on her feet and then began to levitate, some inches off the floor, several inches, and then several more, until she was practically in the air, and they were all looking up at her. A moment passed. Then she stopped levitating and was back on the ground with the brightness going dim and dim until everywhere went back to normal. She was unconscious. Hours later, when she finally opened her eyes, she was back on her bed and it was dusk already. The Alabaster Corps, the elders, and the leader were all gone. Chapter 9. Wilhelm. So much to do, so little time to do it. I paced for a while, my keen gaze capturing the expansive area where large scorched marks were embossed in the earth, leaving certain parts without flowers and grasses. Verrick Plains was a large, fertile ground with a landscape that was forever green. The plains bordered the land of the barbarians, and were maintained by magic that kept the barrier in place, shielding Dreynenn from the rampaging force of the barbarians. This division had been put in place during the War of the Damned, when Dreynenn was under siege by criminals and corrupt officials who joined forces to take power for themselves. They ravaged and killed, raped and butchered, terrorizing the citizens of the community and taking powerful madgelings captive. It was during this trying season that a council of brave men was created to combat these militants. At the helm of the battle was my ancestor, a powerful lord in his time who had to sacrifice his daughter in his quest to protect his hometown. Calling forth the powers of Hecate, he had been granted temporary access to ascend into the land of the mists through a hidden portal that nobody could figure out the location. He landed in Varrock Plains after disappearing for a couple of weeks. He descended into a cloud of fiery smoke, with one single goal: to defend his people. Lord Varrock of the House of Ravens single-handedly won the battle in the town, driving the rebels to the nether regions on the other end of Dreynenn, where they were banished to live in confinement for the rest of their long existence. From there on out, the place was thus called Varrock Plains, so named after the honorable warrior who fought valiantly. Varrock Plains became a place of celebrations, jubilations, and carefree displays of aerobatics and fanfare. My father had been in charge of Dreynenn, and his father before him. The baton of authority was passed from father to son until it was my turn. I grew up in a strict home where my father exercised unwavering discipline over me. In a way, I never had the opportunity to be a child because I had to grow up faster than my peers. Now, as I paced, I watched Orion, the earth madgeling with the silvery hair, get to work. His huge stature and incongruous hair made him formidable. He was the best earth madgeling we had in all of Dreynenn. Earth magic was one of the elements that I didn't completely understand. In a way, it could be likened to nature magic, because both elements derived their source from Mother Nature, taking what provisions the earth gave and replenishing it with the synergy it infused into one's being. It was a beautiful cycle of give and take. The only difference was that nature magic was used to heal, to fight, to communicate with the earth, and also make something grow from it, while earth magic, on the other hand, was directed by a guiding motto of omnis potentia Hecate, which meant that all power belonged to Hecate. The Meudes were not warriors, but scouts, choosing to use their magic to accentuate the goddess of magic herself. Their earth magic was not like the dark art of poison and potion creation, like it was practiced in the House of Ravens. It was more like becoming one with the earth, exchanging information about what was wrong and what could be done to make things right. Earth madgelings could also twist and bend the earth's form into any configuration that took their fancy. When Orion stepped forward with a resigned look on his face, I was heavily burdened. "Well?" I asked. He shook his head. "Veda was right." He glanced down at the parched grounds. "The heat signature here is definitely different. It's like nothing I've ever seen. It means this was not the work of any ordinary fire mage. It's too powerful, too convoluted." In his voice lurked a piece of awe that I didn't fail to pick up on. "Does that mean everything Veda said was right?" Orion shrugged. "I know she was right when she said that the girl is extremely powerful, and I know that no one possesses 3 elements all at once. She didn't steal the ley lines. Hecate chose her to save us from the consequences of the ley lines going haywire." I couldn't wrap my head around it. Why would the daughter of a disgraced madgeling be the chosen heir of the goddess of magic herself? when there were other more worthy candidates? I took my mind back to the evening before. Alicia Laurent has given the grimoires over into my care, and I spent the entire night surveying the contents of the book. Indeed, I found so much knowledge, so much of the ancient ways of casting spells within the pages of the books. Nathaniel Laurent really had a good heart, albeit he was misguided. Throughout the pages of the books, I came across different spells for nurturing, healing, crafting, and binding. Nathaniel was a maestro at what he did. A driblet of guilt slithered into my consciousness. I had ordered an innocent man executed. Well, maybe not entirely innocent, but he didn't deserve the execution or the burial he got. When criminals and rebels were executed, their bodies were cremated, sent into the swirling universe to join the elements and be used up by other madgelings as retribution. Only people who died honorably were given consecrated burials and helped into the other astral plane of existence, where it is believed that souls pass on into a peaceful afterlife. Deciding to focus my attention, I thought about the frustrating hours spent in my study, using the family's witchstone to illuminate the room, as I bent over the task of meticulously going through the pages one after the other in an efficient move. I didn't accept offers of help from my kinsmen, but chose to make this small contribution. It wasn't until I was perusing the last book that I came upon a blank page. Strange, right? It wouldn't have struck me as strange if the pages after that particular one were blank as well. But instead, it seemed like that page was skipped for a reason. I brought the witchstone closer for inspection, and beneath the light, I saw some rough indentations around the edges of the page. This piqued my curiosity greatly. Remembering some of the spells I just discovered, my mind settled on one spell for hidden things. As blind as a bat, but as clear-sighted as a vulture. I see into the things which are not to be seen with eyes, not for seeing, but for revealing. Bring into being what is before me, so the light can be illuminated in the brood for all to behold. Then the blank page shook, and words written in bold red began to appear, one after the other symmetrically. It was befuddling. The words read, "How bemusing it is that the happiest day of my life also turned out to be the most sobering. Today, Alicia put to bed a beautiful baby girl who has the most adorable blue eyes you ever saw, eyes so piercing that you felt enchanted, almost like you were floating through the clear blue skies adrift between clouds. We have decided that she will be named Rosalind, after my favorite flower, Rosa centifolia. Alicia and I can't stop giggling every time she wrinkles her petite nose and every time she smiles at us, like she knows something nobody else does. We both sat observing her for hours, just marveling at the perfect creature we gave life. Alicia thinks that Rosalind will have her flame magic, while I think she will have mine. I am not being selfish, but at the time, I desperately hoped she would have nature magic, because of the tranquility and harmony found in nature. Having this particular element has made me the man I am today, the man who feels the tremors of the earth, who feels every little creation spring to life. I want my daughter to have that same experience. There is nothing as soul-satisfying as watching a little flower grow into a sapling in your palms, knowing that you nurtured it with the spark of life that is inherent in you. Having flame magic, on the other hand, promises nothing but delirium. It invites danger and courts disorder. Flame madgelings are rarely, if ever, peaceful people. My Alicia is the exception, though. She is so gentle and pure at heart that I sometimes wonder if she isn't a crossbreed. Flame madgelings are warriors who invoke devastation at the slightest provocation. I've known several flame madgelings, and besides my wife, No other flame mage has succeeded in overriding their powers. A little disagreement between two fire magelings resulted in the horrendous death of my entire village while I was still very young. That experience scarred me and made me wary of these individuals. It's nothing but an irony that I am married to one now. Alicia knows how dearly I struggled to suppress my feelings when I first met her. One other fire mageling that has reinforced my belief is my wife's sister, Jessie. When I first met Jessie, I thought she was the sweetest angel ever. Subservient, gentle, malleable, and resourceful. In addition, she was very pretty and was bestowed with the best flame dances in recent history. She was the envy of the maidens in the neighborhood. But alas, Jessie is nothing like what she portrays. She is a sadistic and manipulative witch. I caught her in the barn one time torturing a young child whom she claimed stole one of her pigeons. As I looked her in the eye, I knew there was something wrong with her. Her eyes were so bright they looked manic, but I pushed this to the back burner of my mind, where it has become background knowledge. I stay out of her way, and everything is fine. I stopped reading for a moment to exhale. This piece of information would have been handy 6 months ago when we were on the hunt for a cunning killer who left no trace behind after she brutally massacred one of our own, Amelia Maylie. Delving back into the book, I let the words of a deceased man capture my complete attention. I'm in pain right now, not because of any physical inconvenience, but because of what I've just discovered about my newborn. Alicia was in the kitchen making dinner plans with the servants when I noticed something about my daughter. Rosalind was 3 months old at the time and was still in her baby cot. In mid-air, above her head, I saw a swirl of different colors. Fascinated, I drew closer. Squinting my eyes, I made out the shape of a barely formed jasmine petal, and I felt ecstatic knowing that my daughter had my own element. But before I could pull her out for a cozy, heartfelt embrace, I saw a douse of flickering fire devour the jasmine petal, and it went up in flames. Frowning in confusion, I paused. Then, the smoke from the burnt petal slowly changed into glass, reflecting fire within, and like a dream, Rosa sneezed, and a ball of sparkling water doused out the glass in flame. Flabbergasted, I lost my balance. If what I just saw was true, then my daughter was a hybrid. Hybrids were witches and magelings possessing more than one element. Usually possessing 2 elements made you a weird misfit, but it was still within acceptable boundaries. Possessing 3 to 4 elements made you dangerous. Hybrids were extremely powerful and extremely feared. They were rare, almost extinct. If any was discovered, he or she would be hunted and killed because control over their powers was usually dicey. It intoxicated them until they were little better than unruly animals. And how could I endure watching my daughter get subjected to the bath of purity? A ritual bath that drowned an infant until he or she passed on. I shuddered thinking about such things. It was prudent for me to keep this discovery to myself. Alicia would go crazy with worry if she were to know the truth. When I lifted Rosalind into my arms, my eye caught something. It was a small sigil of a wheel with 2 torches and an inflamed dagger with a set of keys. Being the book geek that I was, I recognized it instantly as the mark of Hecate. Ever since then, I've been running around in circles, trying to find an explanation for all of this. I delved into ancient spells, ancient relics, the extensive history of Hecate, everything. But it seemed the only thing left to do was to bind Rosalind's magic. I was filled with utter sadness. That would be like crippling my beautiful daughter. But I had no choice. It was either that or the bath of purity. Nothing could be more severe than watching one's daughter go through that. One thing I discovered about binding her powers was that only one or two elements would slip through. However, the ashlings presented a problem. I needed the blood of an ashling. Considering they were crazy, fast, irrational apparitions with only one goal, to suck the life force out of a madgeling, and considering how powerful Rosalind's life force was, I knew getting her blood would be tricky, and then afterwards, keeping my daughter safe would be paramount. The ashlings would always be after her because they would be drawn to that amount of power. I needed to get rid of them fast. I took a deep breath. So now the truth was out. Nathaniel had bound his daughter's powers to keep her safe. Personally, I didn't hold to the old ways of executing innocent babes because of their inherent gifts. Whatever elements they had, Hecate bestowed, and if they turned out to be undeserving of such gifts, disciplinary measures were put in place to prevent them from hurting others. Another thing that I ruminated upon was the fact that Nathaniel was motivated to get rid of the ashlings because of his daughter. In a way, it made me respect his memory even more. Nathaniel wasn't a deranged, impractical man hell-bent on personal glory, but a father who wanted to give his daughter the assurance of life. It hurt that such a man was killed. Closing my eyes temporarily, the guilt washed over me. But I knew what was done was done. Now circling this Varrock Plains, I was determined to unearth the culprits responsible for corrupting the ley lines. I dismissed Orion and then put on the ring of Minos that I got from the Melees, who released it upon this special occasion. To combat this great evil threatening the existence of every member of Dreynenn, they had no choice but to turn it over. Invoking some chants, I felt myself float, and knew that I was adequately cloaked. Some hours later, leaning against the scorched bark of the old willow tree with its singed leaves, I was dozing off when I happened to look up. The screeching and flapping wings announced the arrival of the ashlings. Night was here, and every member of Dreynenn was behind closed doors. However, it seemed like the ashlings were rushing towards a particular spot. From here, I knew they were heading to the ash square. Getting into gear, the ring of Minos, a black, harmless-looking loop of threads, vibrated and sent a surge of power through me so that I was speeding through the night, feeling the breeze carry me effortlessly. Less than a minute later, I was in Ash Square, over the partition and within the circle of magical stones. As I moved closer to the Aztag tree, I saw two hunched silhouettes walking with stealth towards the ley lines. Hurriedly, their steps carried them closer and closer to the Aztag tree, past the boundary that kept people out and into the golden hub. I knew that I just caught the perpetrators. Slowly and purposefully, my silent strides carried me through the partition until I was behind them. "Looking for something," I spoke, my voice carrying through the night, portent and menacing. I knew they couldn't see me, but I enjoyed watching them squirm. I was curious why the ashlings were giving them a wide berth. In my case, I was fortified with the ring. In their case, what were they fortified with? Releasing the cloaking, I stepped forward into the light. They were startled, but only for a moment. The next moment, fireballs came flying my way, but I dodged them, and immediately, before they knew my intent, I slapped the cuffs of silence onto their wrists, another artifact I got from the colossal archive of the Melee. Abruptly, they yelped and went limp, with the fireballs fizzling away. They were instantly inert. Without further ado, I removed the hood of the first intruder. The mark on his forehead, the mark of a lock, immediately alerted me that he was from the land of the barbarians. How did he get through the wards put in place to keep them out? That wasn't possible. No breach had been reported, so how did he come to be here? Moving on to the next shorter culprit, My jaw almost dropped in shock. It was Arnica Laurent, Rosalind's grandmother. In her hand, she clutched a bejeweled crown, the Phoenix crown, affixed with emeralds and sapphires of every color. Indeed, the crown had been lost all these months, and the Mei Li hadn't said anything about it. As I stared into the hoary eyes, so like the expressive eyes of young Rosalind, I saw that, unlike hers, Arnica's eyes were brimming with hatred and fiery virulence. Unable to stop myself, I grabbed her arms roughly. "Why?" was all I could ask. She was a member of my clan, and she was treated with respect and dignity. So why did she think it was right for her to subject us to such risk?
Because you all deserve it. You killed my daughter, vilified her like some kind of repulsive blight that never mattered. She was my daughter. She had such a bright future.
Your daughter was a psychopath, just like you. You betrayed your own people, left them high-strung. I glanced at her emotionless partner in crime. Did you think the barbarians would shelter you after you siphoned the magic for them?
We all share the same common enemy,
she blurted. I paused. And who is this common enemy? Her dateless eyes disappeared in her creased face for a moment, and I saw vitriol spill out with her next word. Magic! I was confused. Magic is your enemy?
For too long, magic has destroyed my life. It killed one daughter and denied the other daughter of her power, placing my family in ridicule. Not that the silly girl didn't deserve it for choosing to marry a lowlife like Nathaniel Harper.
She rolled her eyes, discussing grave matters like one who was talking about the inconvenience of the weather.
I brought down the wards a bit using this.
She tried to lift the crown, but the cuff prevented her from gesturing freely with its magical sedative. How did you get that? Grandmother laughed bitterly. The sound was as grating as a pack of nails scraping a wall.
My daughter,
Jessie, gave it to me before she was killed by that wretched girl I call granddaughter. She glanced at him with dilated pupils.
Do you know how it feels to watch magic screw you over and over? Of course you don't. You're the great Lord of Dreynenn, the regal, the smart one. I fooled you nicely, didn't I? Just the way Jessie did as well. I only wished she succeeded in getting rid of that stupid girl. I warned her about it, you know.
Her eyes turned misty with memories only she could see.
But she wouldn't listen. Always said the girl was merely a gnat, to be crushed whenever she was in the way.
Grandmother shook her head.
She was wrong in the end. The girl wasn't so easy to crush. Now imagine my surprise when I discover that she is, in fact, a hybrid. What an irony!
As she ranted, I observed. The shrieks and screeches of the ashlings were getting louder and wilder, and I knew that the crown's power of concealment was subdued by the magical cuff of silence. Any moment now, they would descend. But I had some parting words before I made my escape. You know that I have the gift of discernment. I'm telling you right now that the barbarians intend to double-cross as soon as you delivered on your end of the bargain. Scoffing in disbelief, the barbarian tried to deny, but by then I was already climbing down the slope, making my way back to safe haven. They couldn't escape because of the cuff. It would keep them on the spot. As for the ashlings, they would only scare the bejesus out of them, but the crown wouldn't let them come too close, even in its subdued state. Tomorrow would bring with it judgment and exile, but no more execution. I was firm on that. Now, the issue remained: how to fix the ley lines.
Chapter 10. Rosalind. Now is the hour for reckoning. Those words rang in my head over and over. It was a sentence from one of my favorite books that my father used to read out to me when I was much younger. Though I didn't know what it meant at the time, I knew it had to be grave and dire, and those words fit my situation right now. I was going on a trip into the forest of the deep with two others, Veda and Orion. Veda was an eccentric fire mage, but at least I was becoming friends with her. She came to my rescue days before by standing up to confess what she knew, something a lot of others would have kept mum about. Orion, on the other hand, was another case entirely. He was huge, standing over 6 feet tall with a long mane of silvery hair that was quite fascinating, as well as piercing silvery eyes that tended to see right through you. I had it said that Orion of the Miud was an Adonis who attracted women the way fire attracted a moth. He wasn't much of a talker, and that was what I appreciated about him. It had been a week since the revelation. I couldn't say I gained any relief knowing that I was Hecate's heir. Matter of fact, it was burdensome. The grimoires had been returned with a note pointing us to a certain page that wasn't previously discovered. Going through the pages, perceiving the cinnamon and cypress smell that was redolent of my dad, I stopped on the page that looked unfamiliar but penned in my dad's familiar handwriting. I discovered that I was a hybrid, a breed of elementals who had so much power and control of the elements that they were feared in all the lands. I understood perfectly what my dad always said about me not yet reaching my full potential. To keep me safe from the bath of purity that would have ended my life, he bound my powers so that I grew up with only nature magic. It explained why I always felt at odds with myself. It seemed like a part of me was under wraps, unable to rise to the surface. But now I knew just what it was. I had flame magic, but not just that. In addition to flame magic, glass magic, and nature magic, I had water recovery magic as well. From all accounts, I was even showing the propensity to have earth magic. I didn't know if this delighted me, but I knew that I felt utter magic knowing my father lost his life, trying to keep me safe from the life-sucking ashlings who, it turned out, were created for a reason, to prevent a situation where the ley lines were sucked. Not to mention that Aunt Jessie actually succeeded in getting the crown, but before she could harness all the ingredients to properly induce her to accommodate all that power, she was killed. And now, my grandmother turned out to be a different kind of monster entirely. She was the one who orchestrated the corruption of the ley lines by bringing down the wards to sneak in one of the barbarians. For the first time in my life, I saw a barbarian. He was unsightly, with a huge mark of a lock on his forehead. He looked gaunt with sunken eyes that looked cold and lifeless. I didn't know how my grandmother could associate herself with such a person, but I guessed that would be presuming she was mentally balanced herself. As the two culprits were being led through the lands to Craftaline Manor, images of a time when my mother was imprisoned hit me like a flash flood. My grandmother was the worst kind. She hadn't wanted power like her daughter. She wanted revenge, and would have succeeded if not for some turns of events. And if she had, she would have committed mass murder. Magelings and witches and druids were not just entities carrying phenomenal powers and elements. The powers were a part of us that couldn't be separated. Just like in my mum's case, losing our powers would have sickened every one of us, down to the youngest babe. But losing the source of our powers itself, not having magic anywhere in the universe, would have put us through an agonizing death rattle that would have been absolutely horrifying and devastating. My grandmother was deranged to have wanted that kind of revenge,
not caring about the innocent lives that would be lost in the process. Putting thoughts of her and thoughts of my grumpy grandfather aside, I turned to look at Cole, who had Shadow in his arms. Shadow looked resigned in the arms of the person holding him, without his cherished wool carrier. But at least Cole had come to know the eccentric cat enough to know that he fancied the silk handkerchief going through his underbelly. The cat claimed that it made him feel electric, and a smile spread my lips as I recalled the last few days spent together. Shadow had been doting on me since I regained my full strength, but was reluctant to show his true emotions. Beneath the curt orders and proud gestures, I knew there was affection for me. Cole, on the other hand, wore his heart on his sleeve. He doted on me as well, and when I reminisced over the caresses and kisses we indulged in, I felt a thick blush color my cheeks in a telling sign of shyness. Cole, with his chocolate eyes that reminded me of syrup trailing down a pile of those heavenly pancakes that Eisenhower, one of the servants, was famous for making, filled me up with pleasure. He was sweet and charming. Right now, however, there was no smile on his face, similar to my mum's. Alicia Laurent had been devastated by what happened to her mother. Still recovering from the death of 2 of her family members, finding out that her mother would be imprisoned for life was not something she could easily recover from. She was back to looking pale and withdrawn, looking like her low-spirited, droopy self again. It was heartbreaking, but there was nothing I could do. I felt decidedly blue myself, what with all these discoveries. My grandfather had disappeared 2 days ago. No one knew where he was, and no one cared. People were already beginning to feel the effects of the ley lines. Reports of people losing touch with their elements were already going around, and different rumors were spreading like rapid fire. Wilhelm still didn't confirm anything. In my own opinion, I thought of his recalcitrance as selfish. Why didn't he just tell people what was really wrong? Why did he insist on keeping them in the dark when the blight was beginning to show itself? Cole told me that it was normal for a leader to try to keep things under wraps to prevent full-blown out panic. Maybe Wilhelm should have more confidence in his people. That was my rejoinder. It was time to move on now. Each of us had been given artifacts belonging to our specific families. The Phoenix Crown was given to me to take along on this expedition to ward off the attacks of the Ashlings, who would be strongly pulled to me, while Veda was given a cerebral. She was a distant family of the Laurent as well, so her gift was similar to the Phoenix Crown. The cerebral worked to repulse the Ashlings from moving close, while also strengthening her from falling prey to the wiles that could be found in the forest of the deep. Orion of the Miud was armed with Polecat's armor. The Polecat armor protected its charge by taking on the strongest element of the assaulter and using it against him or her. We were prepared for this expedition, but was I mentally prepared? Was I willing to risk my life to help those that killed my father? Seeing as how going contrary to their desires would equal putting an end to magic and life as I knew it, I knew I had no choice but to succumb. Besides, if I was the best chance of combating this evil, then I would give it my all. I only wished my familiar would be allowed to come along. When I presented my case to Wilhelm, I was surprised to see him shrug and tell me to take Shadow along, if it would help me focus more. Underneath his voice, I detected apathy, and I knew he didn't really care what became of my cat, provided he didn't interfere with the mission. It was a bitter realization, but I realized that the understanding we had was a mutual understanding of what was at stake. Beyond that, I don't think I could ever like him, and I don't think he could ever come to tolerate me. As long as we stayed out of each other's way, we would all be fine. Throwing caution to the wind, I gave Cole a long, heartfelt kiss, then bid him goodbye. Shadow was already off his arms and walking regally towards the direction of the forest, after getting permission to come along with us on the trip. Veda explained that since he was a cat, he would be left alone by the ashlings and apparitions. In a way, he would be of help. In case I started to get loopy, he would be there to help me out. Trekking through the forest, we watched as the foliage slowly became dense with copses and bushes, the topology getting more rudimentary as we moved along. Swaying branches, little ferns, canaries, as well as frogs became the scene all around us as the forest came alive with its own life force. The sun beat our bare backs in its intense light rays. An hour into the trek, we stopped to refill our bags with water, indulging in the occasional fruits that we plucked out of branches. As we refilled our water bags, I observed a weird-looking flower with beautiful petals and thistles. I could feel the thistles poking the air, waiting to pierce the skin. As I reached out to touch the unfamiliar flower, Orion jerked me away. Frowning up at him, I bossed, "What was that for?" "I thought you were supposed to be this powerful nature magic and all of that." "So?" I asked, miffed by his underhanded methods. He rolled his eyes. "You've never seen a festro before?" "Fresh what?" He shook his head. "I guess you wouldn't have seen it. It grows in very dangerous places." I pretended not to notice the jab beneath that sentence. "I have nature magic, but I've never seen that particular flower before." It called to me. "Ever heard of the siren's call?" Recalling my time in the human world, I nodded. It was a story about Odysseus, a gallant hero who heard the siren's call and nearly sailed into destruction. He would have lost his life if he had not employed tactics. "The festro looks beautiful, but it carries one of the deadliest venoms in this region. Don't mess with it." With that, he trudged forward and left us behind. Veda moved closer to me, clutching Shadow in her arms. I was surprised that she and Shadow were bonding pretty well, considering how picky and haughty Shadow could be. "I know, right?" The mischievous cat telepathed to me, and I grinned. I could hear the excitement in his voice. "Excitement? Now don't get ahead of yourself," he said sharply, giving me a look of superiority. In the forest with its narrow path, his eyes shone brightly, their green flecks reflecting the color of nature all around. "So what's this siren's call?" Veda slid up beside me, her hand patting the smooth fur of the cat, who raised his front paw for better access. Smug cat. "Sirens are sea creatures who lure sailors to their death with their angelic voices, but they are actually monstrous beings with claws and beaks. Odysseus was a hero from Greek mythology who was lost at sea after venturing out for a war. He was formerly warned of the danger that loomed ahead, but he was a valiant man of war who couldn't sit on the sidelines. I plunged into the story of Odysseus with his cunning ways, outsmarting beautiful enchantresses and sea creatures, and escaping death so many times it was comical. Our voices carried through the dense forest, filling the atmosphere with life and vigor. Ahead of us, Orion hacked away at the branches, pushing away woods and boulders along with setting aside dead creatures. However, his occasional glance backwards told me he was half listening to our conversation. Veda had a look in her eyes every time he glanced back. "What's going on between you two?" I asked, after some minutes of observing the awkward exchange. It was already getting dark, with the moon high up in the sky. I knew that night was almost upon us, and with it, the ashlings and other beings as well. Veda could sense my anxiety. Shadow was resting cozily in my arms by now. She knew I was asking this question to shake off my anxiety. "Well, He and I are complicated. He thinks that I don't share the same feelings.
Why? Veda shrugged.
I don't know. Maybe because we've been childhood friends for too long that I don't know how to go forward from there. I don't want to complicate our friendship.
Before I could respond at that moment, a distant shriek sounded. Shadow jerked in my aching arms, and I let him go to put on my crown. The others also worked to fortify themselves. Out of nowhere, an apparition came rushing at us. It looked pale, so pale you could see right through its eyes. I heard it said that ashlings were souls of tarnished witches who died mysteriously and didn't want to move on, so they roamed this plane without aim until it was impossible for them to move on. From there on out, they became stuck, doomed to live in limbo. The apparition stopped short of touching Orion because his polecat armor merged into a mirror, reflecting the image of the witch back at her. She pulled back and turned her gaze on me. The crown glowed atop my head, but it seemed the brighter it became, the more determined the apparition was to come near. I guess my powers were really quite tempting to such a being. Suddenly, 3 more apparitions were circling us, trying to get as close as possible, but then pulled back in fright when I turned my gaze on them. One headstrong ghost came from the other side, trying to blindside me, but before her deathly hands could reach me, she burst into flames. Now, I was confused about whether or not my flame magic or Hecate's flame came to my rescue. I couldn't dwell on that. The forest was getting invaded by more of these things. Rushing forward, we ran for the clearing straight ahead. Shadow was sprinting off so fast he was a blur. He took some twists and turns, and we followed, the map in my hand forgotten at the moment. Before I could burst out of the forest, I tripped over a branch, and the crown ripped off my head, skipping over a boulder by the wayside and down a trench. The ashling sensed victory and doubled its speed. As it came bearing down on me, I saw the ageless eyes fix themselves on me. As it opened its mouth to begin its sucking, I lifted my hand in defense, and immediately the mark of Hecate began to glow. That heat that preceded an outburst descended. I could hear Orion and Veda screaming on the other side, telling me to reach out to grab the crown up ahead, but I didn't listen to them. I felt power pooling together inside me. While every other person was complaining about weakening powers, I felt powerful, more powerful than ever before. It was like I could feel the beautiful swirling merge of elements come alive inside of me. Like a dam, it fought against the currents, waiting to be unleashed upon these apparitions who were now more than 10, all circling me. The crown was up ahead, but I knew if I took my gaze off them for a moment to grab it, they would take advantage. So I relied on what I had and reached out with fingers spread in front of me. I felt the golden glow rush into every vein, popping with fire and thrumming with untested strength. I locked my hands and fists and struck out. The group of witches suddenly combusted violently in a tornado of sand. Rising to my feet, I looked around and saw that my friends were already out of the forest, reaching out for me. My vision wavered for a moment. When next I opened my eyes, I took some steps and then reached out. Cole pulled me over. That was a beautiful show, Rosalind.
Yeah. Breath rushed out of me noisily. He placed his hand around my shoulder.
We need to leave now, though.
I glanced up at him, feeling safe by those strong arms embracing me. Why? What of the others?
They returned a while ago. Nobody knows what to expect at this point. However, I think I've found a loop, something to help you escape this erosion of magic.
What is it?
I was genuinely curious.
I spent restless and sleepless nights trying to see another angle to solve this dilemma, but it seemed that a human would finally be the one to save us all. I was glad it was Cole Huxley. I saw a small cave down on the other side, and it contained a book full of spells with instructions on how to protect and ward off the corruption of the ley lines from affecting you solely. I frowned. I had not known about that. Does it say anything about saving everybody else? I dusted the sand off my hands, getting back my bearing. Cole suddenly stopped working and looked down at me, his chocolate eyes illuminating the entirety of his handsome face. No, it doesn't. It only reveals the truth, that nothing can be done to save everybody else. But you can save yourself. No, there should be something. I wasn't ready to admit defeat. I didn't come all this way for nothing. I couldn't let down all the people depending on me. My mum. And Shadow was as much a part of the magical world as any elemental. Everybody, even Orion and Veda, risked their lives to join me on this trip. Wait, where were they? Cole, where are Veda and Orion? They were just here. I looked around, seeing vegetation that was the same all around. I could sense it in my gut that something wasn't quite right. Cole, where are... My breath was cut short when he grabbed me roughly. You're not listening to me. Forget about the others. There is still a chance to save yourself. Cole, you're hurting me. Hold on. A light came on in my head. Wasn't Cole back home? As much as I wanted his comforting presence, I could remember giving him a goodbye kiss. Whoever this was, he wasn't Cole. Cole would never give up on everybody. He would fight tooth and nail to save everybody else. Jerking away, I said, "You are not Cole." Baby, you're not listening to me. Of course I'm Cole. You like my chocolate eyes that remind you of Eisenhower's pancakes and syrup, don't you? Immediately wary, I jerked away and raised my hand in defense. This was definitely not Cole. I never told him about what I thought of his eyes. I only told him they were big and beautiful. Be gone from me! Firing off with all my strength, I poured out my anger on the person in front of me. Immediately his shape changed, and then he turned into vapor. It wasn't Cole. Through the vapor, I saw Veda and Orion staggering to their feet with Shadow watching us by the side, anxious and confused. What happened? I sent him the words in my mind. You've just been glamored. Glamored? I don't understand. I don't either. But it seems like the air here makes you hallucinate. Oh. I turned to the others. Rosalind? I saw you die. I saw the apparitions kill you. Veda rushed to hug me, her brash no-nonsense attitude giving way for her sweet nature to shine through. No, I think we all hallucinated for some minutes. I glanced around. It was past dusk now. Almost morning, or more, I concluded. All around, there were grasses to replace the thick vegetation from the forest. I opened the map and saw that we were close to Stardew Valley. No wonder. There was something in the air here that obviously distorted reality. We kept on walking, enjoying the cool breeze, the silence. Shadow hopped along. Everyone was lost in his or her own thoughts until we got to a place called the Place of Truth. Here, the path veered off in two different directions with no sign of its end in sight. I saw Wilhelm on one end and Aunt Jessie on the other end. Drawing back in shock, my eyes were transfixed on the radiant presence of my deceased aunt. Aunt Jessie? She reached out a hand. Yes, it's your aunt. But you...
You died.
I did. On some level, you hold yourself responsible, not just for my death, but for the loss of your father and the loss of your mother's flame magic. Take my hand. Forgive yourself. On the other end, Wilhelm blurted, Now why would you want to take the coward's way out when you can have your revenge? You can take out your frustration on me now and drive that spear right through my eyes the way you always imagined. I killed your father, ordered his execution, and all for what? Wilhelm smiled lackadaisically. Because he was trying to save his precious daughter. Well, guess what? You killed him. If it were not for you, he would still be alive, roaming the walls of your home, with his cinnamon and citrus fragrance mingling in the air as he drank his lemonade tea. Your mum would probably still know how to smile because she would have him there as a guide. But you ruined everything, did you not? Tears were rushing down my face now, rapidly. No, I didn't know. Of course you didn't know. Just the way you didn't know that you were going to end up killing your aunt in that fight when you could have tried another alternative. Just the way you didn't know that going to Dandelion Fields would bring ashlings rushing to hurt you. You know how much your parents told you to stay away from there, but you refused to listen to their warnings. And in the process, your mum lost her magic. But more than that, she became an outcast. Imagine, the fiery princess became a misfit amongst the people she used to rule over. And all for your ungrateful little hide. Feeling the pain of the memories he invoked, my tears burnt my cheeks as the waterworks descended rapidly. In a way, he was right. I was the culprit responsible for the family's misfortune. No, you are not, Aunt Jessie said quietly. Yes, I am. What do you know? Your death is proof that I destroy everything I touch. Baby girl, don't blame yourself for my mistakes. You did what you had to do to save your mother and get justice done. Wilhelm shouted, She lies! That's what she always did, wasn't it? From killing that little girl to chasing your family around in a circle, she fooled you all. So why is it hard to believe she's doing the same now? His words rang true in my ears. Rosalind, search your own heart and see the truth for yourself. No one holds you responsible for any of it. You are the chosen one. Believe that. Believe your father's words. You are his Rosa centifolia. Looking up, Aunt Jessie changed and metamorphosed into an image of my father. His eyes were tired. He was wearing the clothes in which I saw him last, but he was smiling. My little Rosa, he called in that thick baritone voice that filled me up with sunny warmth. I started to rush to him. So happy was I, but it seemed like I couldn't move past this spot. Wilhelm said one more time, Are you going to just let this go? You have this one chance to avenge your family. Won't you step up and take the chance? Why must you botch this opportunity as well? Don't listen to him, my dad said. He didn't have to bother. All my attention was on him. There was so much I wanted to say, so much I wanted to ask, but beyond that, I just wanted to feel his arms around me, smell that cinnamon scent all over him. Dad? You are rooted to the spot, baby Rosa. You have to make your choice before moving on. You have grudges in you, grudges and resentment. It's going to destroy you if you don't let go. You need to move on. Forgive those that wronged you. Forgive yourself, Rosa.
Only then will you be able to move on to the land of the mists. You need to remove all hatred and loathing from your heart. None of this is your fault. Hecate chose you because she sees your heart. Let go, baby. But it wasn't easy to do that. All these years of accumulating the pain inside, not having an outlet for the pain, I didn't know how to even begin. One step at a time, Rosa. One step at a time. Looking into his expressive eyes, so much like mine, I let it go. All the hatred, all the resentment, all the pain, I let it go. And then I felt the binds holding me in place go back down into the earth. I began to move, rushing towards my dad. I felt his hands go around me, and I breathed in the scent of cinnamon. Dad? My voice shook with raw emotion. My little Rosa, I will always love you. Know that. I regret none of what's happened. It was meant to be. You have to be strong for your mother. She needs you now more than ever. Yes, sir. But I need you too. My voice broke on the last two words. My dad shook his head, light spilling around him. Suddenly, he reached for my hair and pulled out a rose, just like he always did. See what I found? Beautiful Rosa centifolia, we murmured and laughed. But now I have to go. I held on tighter, tears still flowing freely. Why do you have to go? I want you here with me. Forever. You know that's not possible, my beautiful centifolia. But know that I'm always with you. As he spoke, his form began to fade away until only the sound of his voice remained. I will always love you, Rosa. You and your mother both. Never forget it. No, not again. No! Feeling the loss all over, I collapsed on the ground, surrounded by cool grasses that rushed to cushion my abrupt fall. I heaved and retched in pain, feeling alone. You are not alone. Hoping my father was back, I looked around only to find Shadow, Veda, and Orion staring at me with empathic expressions on their faces. I rose to my feet wordlessly, suddenly gaining the strength I needed to carry on with the task at hand. Let's go, I said. Check your map. At this point, you have to go on without us, Orion replied. I glanced down at the map and saw that I was about to enter Stardew Valley. Behind me, the sunlight was bright and resplendent up ahead. I can't even take Shadow? Nope. We believe in you, baby girl. Taking a deep breath, I nodded, sent them my goodbyes, and bent to scoop Shadow in my hands. You are the best, little man. Sure, of course, I know that. He pretended to yawn. Take care, all right? If you don't return, know that I will make it my mission to frustrate that dweeb back home. The cat threatened in his own way. I knew he didn't want to see me go. I love you too. Placing a kiss on his snout, I put him down carefully and then walked down one path, the path my father had been moments before. This is not goodbye. With that, I stepped into the bright cacophony of light. My hands went up to shield my face from the blinding light. Then it dimmed, and I opened my eyes. Behold, I was standing in the middle of the most beautiful garden I ever saw, both in the human realm and in all of Dreynenn. The sky was an explosive blend of rainbow colors, from electric blue to alizarian red to sapphire green to Boris. It was amazing, conjuring roses and tulips, I knew I was now in Stardew Valley, accentuated by the light dew descending in snowflakes and fog close to the ground. At the far end of the garden, I saw a dome glass with wisps of white fire flickering brilliantly in the sunlight. It was all so iridescent, calling to the elements within me. Then I heard a disembodied voice. When the earth shall revolt, and power seems untrue, then, with the fire of light, Hecate air holds true. Are you worthy of possessing this fire? I am Rosalind Laurent of the... I know who you are. Are you worthy of possessing the golden dome of fire in which light is given to Dreynenn once again? I believe that... I turned around, trying to locate the source of the voice. I believe that I am. Do you believe you are? Or do you know you are? Rosa centifolia. My voice suddenly balanced in its tandem, and I answered with confidence. I heard my father's voice resonate within me. He always told me that I could do anything, be anything I wanted. I am worthy of possessing the golden dome of fire to take back to my people in order to prevent the looming catastrophe ahead. Without the fire, magic will be obliterated completely. Then go. Take it. It is yours. That easily? I thought. I was given a jolt when the voice responded. Yes. That easily. And with that, I reached for the golden dome of fire. It was very light in my hands, reflecting light at all angles, capturing my complete attention. It resonated with a symphony of peace and serenity, settling every insecurity in my heart and filling me up with pride. Closing my eyes, I was catapulted back to Dreynenn. I was suddenly standing in front of Ash Square with no memory of how I got here. See what she has in her hands? Isn't that the mystical golden dome of fire? What is she doing here? I heard the speculations of people around me, but I felt invincible, powerful, and what they thought of me didn't matter. Purposefully, I marched forward, not stopping even the alabaster core positioned at the partition before the circle of stones tried to stop me. Wilhelm the Regal was there to halt their actions. I waited a moment to feel the rancorous feelings that filled me up whenever I saw him. But none were forthcoming. I was truly healed, devoid of the hatred. It felt liberating. The elders, the core, Wilhelm, and everybody present gave me a wide berth as I marched to the ley lines, with feet that were almost levitating off the ground. Stopping in front of the ley lines, I noticed that the color was almost completely gone. Only a sickening thread of black remained. As I bent down to administer the fire, like I was instructed to, I felt flame magic burst within me, supported by nature magic, and wind magic rolled in along with earth magic. The earth parted ways, giving me access to the core of the lines. It thrummed and vibrated, hot and poignant with power. The golden dome of fire thrummed in response, eager to heal what was broken, fix what was damaged. After turning the fire into the core, there was an earthquake that rattled the ground, a tremor that went all over the region. People were frightened, but they knew that the ley lines were just fixed. Water madgelings flexed their powers. Fire madgelings threw up balls of fire. Earth madgelings connected with the earth. It was a beautiful sight to behold. Leaving the circle of stones, I saw Wilhelm. He was about to say something when I stopped him with, "I forgive you." With that, I moved on. There was Orion and Veda holding hands. By the other side, Shadow stood resting against Cole and my mother, who was finally smiling, at last. rushing to meet my family. I was at peace with myself. The atmosphere erupted in a loud cacophony of melodious cheers, and I knew I was just crowned the savior of Dreynenn, restorer of magic. How utterly fulfilling. The end. This has been Mystical and Magical, a Bailey Bay Cozy Mystery, Bailey Bay Cozy Mysteries Book 3, written by Catherine Waltan, narrated by Adrian Fleming, copyright 2021 by Catherine Waltan, production copyright by Catherine Waltan.